The mist in Gray Mist Valley did not burn off by noon. It clung to the pines like a shroud and settled heavy in the main street of Gallows Ridge, Montana Territory. The year was 1878, and the cold had come too early, promising a winter that would test a man's bones and a woman's soul. Rose Whitaker felt the cold. She was a woman of perhaps 28 years. Though the town treated her as if she were a spinster of 50, she was not pretty. The town had decided this, and they reminded her of it in the way their eyes slid past her, in the way the men never offered to carry her flour, in the way the women whispered behind their gloves. Rose had a square jaw, hands made broad by kneading dough, and eyes the color of muddy water. But those hands could bake. She lived by her oven, a small, fierce god of iron and heat that she fed with pine scraps. Her immediate goal was simple: earn enough coin to pay Mrs. Dalton for her rented room. Her deeper goal, the one she barely let herself whisper in the dark, was to have a place that was not a room, but a home. To be seen not for what she lacked in beauty, but for what she held in skill. Gallows Ridge was a town built on promises and perched on the edge of a cliff. The mountains lunged up behind it, sharp and gray, holding the new silver mine that was the town's beating, frantic heart. Luther Pike owned that heart. The promise of a railroad track, meant to snake through the valley within 2 years, had brought a flood of men with empty pockets and hard eyes. With them came the noise, the prejudice, and the unspoken law of the frontier, which was mostly about who held the heaviest hand and the quickest temper. A wagon rumbled past, loaded with blasting powder for Pike's mine, and Rose pulled her shawl tighter. The smell of frying grease from the saloon kitchen mixed with the metallic tang of dust and distant pine. It was market day, and the street was a chaos of noise. "That rent is due by noon tomorrow, Miss Whitaker." The voice cut through the din like a dull knife. Mrs. Dalton, her landlady, stood with her arms crossed. She was a woman dried out by bitterness, her face a map of disapproval. "I am not running a charity house." "You will have it, Mrs. Dalton," Rose said, her voice quiet but steady. She would not look down. "See that I do, Mrs." Dalton turned, her black skirts sweeping the boardwalk, and continued on her path of judgment. On the saloon porch, a group of men watched the exchange. Their voices, the town's collective voice, carried easily. "Pity a woman has to live on baking bread, ought to find a husband." "Who'd have her?" another man snickered. Rose ignored them, adjusting a loaf of sourdough on her small wooden stall, her fire against their blizzard. Further down the street, near the stables, a man stood in the shadows of the overhang. He was built like the mountains he lived in, broad and quiet. Samuel Hayes. The town called him the Mountain Man, and they said it with a shiver. He was a former scout, a man who had known the valley before the silver boom, before Gallows Ridge had a name. His wife, a Cheyenne woman, had died some years back, and he had retreated up the mountain slope to a cabin the town had only ever seen from a distance. He traded furs, kept to himself, and was rumored to be as cold as the stone he lived on. He watched the market, his gaze missing nothing, least of all the quiet dignity of the woman selling bread. Not far from him, another man stood, though he was not part of the town's chaos. Red Hawk watched the valley with a different kind of intensity. He was a Cheyenne warrior, his face calm, his eyes holding the long memory of his ancestors. He was not a man of the new Gallows Ridge. He was a man of the land itself, the streams, the elk paths, the sacred grounds where his grandfathers lay. His goal was not to earn coin, but to keep his world from being shattered by the mine's greed and the railroad's iron. He saw the blasting powder wagon, and his mouth tightened. Luther Pike's violence was digging into the earth, and Red Hawk knew that kind of hunger never stayed buried. Luther Pike himself was not a man to stand in the street. He operated from the quiet, plush office above the Silver Slipper Saloon. He was the force behind the mine, the owner of the henchmen who kept the saloon quiet and the miners in line. He was a man who saw the valley not as a home, but as a resource to be emptied, a map of profits waiting to be claimed. He was the source of the town's frantic energy and its deepest fears. Rose sold a small cornbread loaf to a miner. Her hands chapped from the lye soap and the cold. She counted the coins. Not enough. Not nearly enough. She stood at a threshold, a doorway between solvency and the street, and the door was closing. The society of Gallows Ridge was rigid. It demanded harsh piety from its women, expecting them to be wives or mothers, or invisible, a woman alone. Like Rose, was a puzzle they solved with scorn, and their scorn for a woman like her was second only to their open hatred for Red Hawk and his people. The Cheyenne were called savages on the same saloon porch that judged Rose's unmarried state. The rules were simple and terrible. A sudden gust of wind, colder than the last, swept down the street, rattling the wooden sign of the mercantile. It smelled of snow, a deep, high mountain snow, not the light dust of autumn. Winter was not just coming, it was leaping down from the peaks. Above the town, a flock of crows began to circle. They rode the currents of the wind, black specks against a sky the color of slate. They were watching, waiting. They seemed to signal a storm that had nothing to do with the weather, a storm of men and greed and desperation that was about to break over Gray Mist Valley. Rose Whitaker looked up at the crows, then back at her few remaining loaves, and set her jaw. She just needed to get through tomorrow. Rose Whitaker had set up her stall by 9:30 in the morning, the weak sun doing nothing to fight the damp. Her 36 loaves of sourdough, rye and cornbread were arranged on the small plank table, each one a testament to an early morning of smoke and sweat. The smell of fresh bread was a small, warm island in the street's cold air. It was not enough to keep the loafers away. A group of them, men with nothing better to do than lean against the assayer's office, began their usual sport. "That bread looks harder than last week. Miss Whitaker," one of them called out, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Needs a husband to soften her up. And her bread," another added, to a round of low, cruel chuckles. Rose kept her eyes on her table, her face set. She was arranging her coin box when a shadow fell over her. It was not a customer. "Noon tomorrow. Miss Whitaker. Mrs." Dalton's voice was loud, pitched for the entire street to hear. She had come for her public payment of shame. I counted on that room being paid for. I am not a woman who enjoys being disappointed. The loafers on the porch quieted, eager for a better show. Even the blacksmith, his hammer falling silent, turned to watch. The street held its breath. Rose felt the blood rush to her face, a hot tide of humiliation. She had $2.14 in her box. The rent was $5. She was being priced, in public, like a head of cattle, and found wanting. She finally looked up, her gaze sweeping past the smug face of Mrs. Dalton, past the curious eyes of the townsfolk, and landed in the deep shadow of the stables. Samuel Hayes was there. He had not moved, but he was watching. His presence was a solid, undeniable thing, like a boulder. He was not smiling. He was simply observing, his gaze level. Something inside Rose, a thing that had been bent low for years, suddenly straightened. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of being defined by what she was not. She turned her head slightly, her voice not loud, but clear, carrying across the space to the man in the shadows. "I am not pretty, sir," she said, her voice shaking only a little, "but I can cook." It was a statement, a creed, a desperate bid thrown into the void. It was not a plea. It was a declaration of value, her last and only coin. The silence that followed was absolute. The loafers stopped chewing. Mrs. Dalton's mouth opened slightly. Then Samuel Hayes moved. He stepped out of the shadow and into the pale light, and the crowd parted for him without a sound. He was a big man in moccasins that made no noise on the hard-packed earth. He wore a heavy buffalo coat, and his beard was thick, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He stopped in front of Rose's stall. He did not look at her face. He looked at the bread. He pointed a gloved finger at the sourdough. "How much for this one?" 10 cents, sir," Rose managed. He nodded. Then he pointed to the whole table. "How much for all of it?" Rose's mind fumbled. "Sir, all of it," he repeated, his voice a low rumble. "What is the price for the work?" She did the sums in her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. $3.60. For all 3 dozen. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and, without counting, pulled out a heavy stack of coins. He placed them on the table. They were silver dollars. 6 of them. "This is too much," Rose whispered. "It is only—" "I am not buying bread, madam," Samuel Hayes said, his voice quiet but final. "I am paying for the baker's time. It is a fair price." He began to lift the loaves, one by one, into a large burlap sack he carried. He was not saving her. He was conducting a transaction, respecting the craftsman. The town watched, mute. This was not a rescue. This was something they did not have a word for. Mrs. Dalton's face had turned a dull, angry red. From across the street, Red Hawk stood near his own wagon, his face impassive. He had watched the entire scene. As Samuel Hayes turned to leave, Red Hawk met Rose's eye. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of recognition. Samuel shouldered the heavy sack as if it were air and walked away, melting back toward the stables without a backward glance. The spell broke. The blacksmith's hammer began to ring again. The crowd, disappointed and confused by the lack of a proper drama, went back to its business. Mrs. Dalton was the last to move. She stared at the 6 silver dollars sitting on the plank table. She looked at Rose. "That changes nothing," she hissed, her voice low this time. "If that money is not in my hand by noon tomorrow, you will be on the street. Do you understand me? Miss, on the street." She turned and marched away, her dignity restored by the threat. Rose stared at the coins. She had enough. She had enough for the rent, and enough for more flour. She had been seen. She was not sure if she felt saved or terrified. She packed her empty stall onto her small cart and hitched her old, sway-backed horse, Barnaby. The air had grown colder, the sky a deep, bruised purple over the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. The wind had a new voice, a high, thin whine that spoke of ice. It took her an hour to get clear of the town. The road out to her small, rented cabin was nothing more than a set of ruts in the frozen mud. The clouds that had been gathering over the peaks now unrolled across the valley, a vast black ceiling that smothered the last of the light. Barnaby grew nervous, pulling at his bit, his ears flicking back and forth. A low rumble of thunder, impossible for this time of year, echoed from the high canyons. It was not thunder. It was the sound of the mountains, settling in for the storm. Rose urged the horse on, her hands numb inside her thin gloves. She just wanted the fire in her own stove, the door barred against the night and the judgment of the town. Then the world tilted. The right wheel of her cart found a deep, ice-filled rut that she had not seen in the dusk. There was a sharp, dry crack, like a gunshot, and the cart lurched violently, throwing Rose from her seat. She landed hard on the frozen ground. The breath knocked from her lungs. She lay there for a moment, stunned, the air searing her throat. Barnaby, bless his loyal heart, had only stumbled a few paces and stood, trembling. Rose pushed herself up. Her hip ached, but nothing felt broken. She went to the cart. The wheel was not just stuck, it was shattered. The axle, the thick piece of oak she had oiled just last month, had snapped clean in two. She was stranded. She was 3 miles from town, and 2 from her cabin. The dark was falling like a hammer, and the first hard, stinging pellets of sleet began to sting. She was exposed, and she was alone. The cold, which had been a threat, was now a predator. She tried to unhitch Barnaby, thinking she could ride him, but her fingers were too numb to work the frozen leather straps. A wave of true panic, cold and sharp, rose in her chest. This was how people died, not in a blaze of glory, but in a stupid, muddy ditch with a broken wheel. She heard it before she saw it. The slow, steady sound of heavy hooves and the creak of a large, well-greased wagon. A lantern swung in the gloom, illuminating a team of 4 massive draft horses. Behind them sat the mountain man, Samuel Hayes, high on the seat of a canvas-covered freight wagon. He pulled his team to a halt. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply climbed down, holding the lantern high. He walked over to her broken cart and crouched, the light falling on the splintered axle. He touched the raw wood with a glove. The sleet was turning to snow, sticking to the shoulders of his coat. He stood up, his face unreadable in the swinging light. The axle is split clean. It cannot be fixed tonight. Rose started, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. I can walk. No, he said, you cannot. He looked toward her cabin, then back at the town. You will be frozen before you make a mile. He turned back to his wagon. He did not offer his hand. Get in the wagon, he said. It was not a request. Where are you going? To my place. It is the only roof between here and the storm. Rose hesitated. To go with this man, this stranger, this mountain man the town whispered about. It was ruin. It was the end of what little reputation she had. Mrs. Dalton would not just evict her, she would crucify her. Samuel Hayes seemed to read her thoughts. He looked up at the sky, which was now a churning mass of white. Your reputation or your life? Madam, the mountain does not care which one you choose. I am leaving. He climbed up onto the wagon seat. He was going to leave her. Her survival instinct, the same instinct that had made her declare her worth in the marketplace, took over. Ruin was better than a grave. She grabbed her empty coin box and scrambled over the wagon wheel, clumsy with cold, and huddled into the small space on the wagon seat beside him. He did not look at her. He picked up the reins. One condition, he said, his voice level. Get in, and do not ask questions. He had already said, get in, and she was in. The second part was the real price. Rose pulled her thin shawl tighter, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She nodded, her chin buried in the wool. I will not. Samuel Hayes snapped the reins, and the heavy wagon lurched forward, leaving her broken cart and her old life behind in the ditch. The ride up the mountain was a silent battle against the wind. The wagon climbed a switchback trail that Rose had never known existed, rising above the valley floor. The snow was a solid wall, a white darkness that swallowed the sound of the horses' hooves and the groaning of the wagon. Rose sat huddled, her body rigid with cold, her mind numb. She had kept her word. She had not asked a single question. Samuel Hayes did not speak. He handled the team of 4 heavy horses with an assured, quiet strength, his shoulders set against the storm. He seemed a part of the mountain itself, as solid and as unforgiving as the rock. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon leveled out. They passed a large, dark barn and pulled up to a long, low log house. It was not a cabin. It was a fortress, built to withstand the very weather that was now trying to tear it apart. He helped her down, his grip on her elbow firm and impersonal. He left her on the porch while he unhitched the team, leading them into the barn. Rose stood by the door, her back to the storm, waiting. She was not a guest. She was cargo that had been delivered. He returned, his coat covered in white, and unlocked the heavy wood door. He pushed it open and stood back, gesturing for her to enter. The first thing she felt was not warmth, but a deeper cold. The house was dark. The main room was vast, with a high ceiling, but it was lifeless. It was impeccably neat, the floors swept clean, a rifle resting on wooden pegs above the fireplace. But it was the tidiness of a place that held no people. It lacked the clutter of living. The air was still and held no scent of food or smoke. The great stone hearth was black and cold. The walls were silent. "You can sleep there," Samuel said, pointing to a small alcove off the main room. It held a simple cot and a trunk. "The blankets are in the trunk." He then went to the fireplace, not to build a fire for warmth, but to light a small lantern. He set it on a massive plank table in the center of the room. "The storm will last the night, maybe 2 days. You are safe here." He turned, as if to retreat to another part of the house, leaving her to her cot. But Rose was not a guest, and she was not a victim. She was a baker, a woman of work. She could not sit on a cot and wait to be saved. The cold, dead kitchen was an offense to her. "Sir," she said, her voice small in the big, empty room. He stopped, turning. "The kitchen," she said, nodding toward a dark archway. "If I may, I have $6. I will pay for what I use." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable in the lantern light. He seemed to be weighing a decision far more complex than she could understand. Finally, he gave a single nod. "Do what you will." He disappeared down a dark hall, and she heard a door close. Rose let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She was alone. She picked up the lantern and walked into the kitchen. It was like the rest of the house, large, clean, and dead. A massive iron stove, a high-quality range. Sat cold. Sacks of flour, beans, and cornmeal were stacked neatly against a wall. Smoked hams hung from the rafters. This was a place stocked for a siege, but used by a ghost. She set the lantern down. Her hands were shaking, but not just from cold. She was in her element. She found the kindling box, the wood stacked and dry. She laid a fire in the stove, her chapped hands working with a lifetime of practice. When she struck the match, the flame catching the dry shavings, it felt like the first true breath she had taken all day. The stove began to crackle, a small, brave sound against the roar of the wind outside. The iron began to tick as it warmed. The house had a heartbeat again. She found a sack of pinto beans and a side of salt pork. She put a great pot of water on to boil. She found the flour, a fine-milled, expensive flour, in her hands. Acting on their own, began to measure, to mix, to knead. She was not just making food. She was pushing back the dark. She was claiming her place in this cold, silent house, not with words, but with work. The smell of yeast and warm flour began to fill the room, a defiant act of life. She needed a cloth to cover the dough. She opened a door near the pantry, thinking it a linen closet. It was not. It was a small room, empty but for a single wooden rocking horse, covered in a light layer of dust. It was beautifully made, with a carved mane and a worn leather saddle. It had been rocked, once, by someone small. It was the only thing in the entire house that spoke of a life other than Samuel's, a scar. Rose quietly closed the door. Her heart aching, she found a dish towel elsewhere. She put the beans on to simmer, slid 2 loaves of bread into the warming oven to rise, and set a pot of coffee to brew. The kitchen was no longer cold. It was bright and warm, and it smelled of hope. She was stirring the beans when a shadow fell across the porch window. It was late, deep into the night. A man was standing outside, framed against the swirling snow. Rose froze, her hand gripping the wooden spoon. Before she could cry out, the main door of the house opened and closed. Samuel Hayes walked into the kitchen, followed by Red Hawk. The Cheyenne warrior was covered in snow. He and Samuel looked at each other, and a conversation began that Rose could not understand. It was short, guttural, and urgent. Red Hawk gestured, his hands shaping the words she could not hear. Samuel replied in the same tongue, his voice low. Red Hawk looked past Samuel and saw Rose for the first time. His gaze was not surprised, but assessing. He looked at the stove, at the rising bread, at the pot of beans. Then he looked at Samuel and said something that sounded final. Samuel nodded. He turned to Rose. "He says the storm is deep. His people will go around the valley. They will not be seen." Red Hawk gave a brief, sharp nod to Rose, the same gesture of recognition from the market. And then he was gone. Back into the storm, as silent as he had arrived. Samuel watched him go. He came the high path. He will be in the next territory by dawn. He looked at the stove, and the steam rising from the pot. "The house smells like bread." He said it as a simple fact, then turned and left her alone again. Rose did not sleep on the cot. She sat in a chair by the warm stove, dozing, while the beans simmered and the bread baked. When the first gray light of morning filled the windows, the storm had not stopped. The world outside was a churning, white void. She heard Samuel moving in the main room. He came into the kitchen. He had not slept. He looked at the two perfect, golden brown loaves of bread cooling on the counter. He looked at the pot of beans. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had kept hot. He took a long drink, the silence stretching between them. "I have a crew of 5 men," he said, his back to her. "They work my ranch, further up the mountain. They are tired of my cooking. They are tired of jerky and cold biscuits." He turned to face her. "The storm has snowed you in. When it clears, you can leave. Your cart will be fixed. Or you can stay." Rose stared at him. "Stay?" "I need a cook for the winter, to feed my crew. There is a room for you, separate from the men's bunkhouse. You will be paid a salary. $3 a in and out. And your keep." It was a fortune. It was more than a fortune. It was a room, and it was work. She knew what the town would say. A woman, unmarried, living under the roof of Samuel Hayes. The rumors would be vile. Mrs. Dalton would see her as worse than a common prostitute. She would be utterly ruined. She looked at the stove, at the work of her own hands. Then she thought of the alternative, returning to Gallows Ridge, hat in hand, to beg Mrs. Dalton for a room she could no longer afford, to face the snickering loafers, to be slowly frozen out, to starve. Ruin or starvation. "I am not pretty, sir," she said, repeating her words from the market. But this time, they were a question. "I am not hiring a wife," he said, his voice flat. "I am hiring a cook. Can you do the work?" "I can," she said, her voice clear. "Then it is settled." Just as the words were spoken, a sound came from the back door, a scratching, like a small animal. Rose looked at Samuel, but he was looking at the door. He unbarred it and pulled it open. A small boy, no older than 8, fell into the room. He was a wisp of a thing, his face blue with cold, his clothes nothing but filthy rags. He looked up at them, his eyes wide with terror, then scrambled toward the stove, his gaze fixed on the cooling bread. "Elias," Samuel said, his voice hard, "I told you to stay with the horses." The boy ignored him, his hand reaching for the loaf. Before Samuel could stop him, Rose had broken off a huge piece of the warm bread and knelt, holding it out. "Here," she said softly. "Eat." The boy, Elias, snatched it and began devouring it like a wolf, his eyes never leaving her face. "He is an orphan," Samuel said, his voice tight with disapproval. "His parents died of fever in town. He has been sleeping in my barn, stealing my eggs. I let him stay if he works." "He is starving," Rose said, not looking up. She poured a mug of milk she had found a jug in the cold pantry and gave it to him. "We do not give charity here," Samuel said. "It is not charity to feed a child," Rose said, her voice sharp. Elias finished the bread and milk and looked at the stove, then at Samuel, his fear returning. Samuel sighed, a long, hard breath. He pointed to the kindling box. "The box is empty. Elias, you ate, now you work. Fill it, then you will have a bowl of beans." The boy scrambled to his feet, grabbing the box. "Yes, sir." "And you will chop wood for the kitchen stove every morning. If you do not work, you do not eat. That is the fairness." Yes, sir. The boy ran out the door, the empty box clutched in his hand. Rose stood up. A new, fragile thing had just been formed in the room. A man who needed a cook, a woman who needed a home, and a boy who needed everything. A working family. The fragile peace was broken an hour later by the sound of heavy horses and loud voices from the front of the house. Samuel's face darkened. He walked to the window and looked out. "Stay in the kitchen. Rose." "Who is it?" "Trouble." He went to the main room. Rose heard the front door open. The sound of snow-caked boots on the wood floor. Hayes, a loud, falsely cheerful voice boomed, "A hell of a storm to catch you in. We were checking our high pasture lines and thought we would see if you were still alive up here." Rose crept to the kitchen doorway. She could see them. Luther Pike, his face red from the wind, his expensive coat covered in snow. Behind him stood two of his hired men, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. "I am alive, Pike," Samuel said. His voice was flat. He had not invited them in. "Good, good." Pike stamped his feet, surveying the room, his eyes sharp, missing nothing. "A comfortable place you have here. A bit empty. A man needs companionship in a place like this, especially with winter coming on so hard." His gaze slid past Samuel and locked onto the kitchen archway. He saw her. A slow, ugly smile spread across Luther Pike's face. Well, it seems it is not as empty as I thought. Found yourself some companionship after all." "Hayes, I did not know Miss Whitaker made house calls." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Samuel Hayes did not move. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his gun. He simply stood, his presence filling the doorway. A wall of quiet, cold granite. "Your horses are freezing. Pike," Samuel said, "you should go." Pike's smile wavered. He had come to probe, to find a weakness, and he had been met with a closed door. He tried to laugh it off. "Just being neighborly. Hayes, just being neighborly. We will see ourselves out." The door shut, the bar sliding home with a heavy, final sound. Samuel Hayes turned back to the main room. He did not look at Rose. He walked to the cold fireplace, took the rifle from the wall, and began to clean it, his hands moving with a precise, steady economy. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the stove was warm, the beans were simmering, and a small boy was bringing in a load of freshly split wood. The house was no longer silent, and it was no longer empty. The snowstorm lasted 4 days. For 4 days, the world was a white, roaring chaos, a world reduced to the space between the log house and the barn. Inside, a new rhythm was established, governed by the iron stove and the needs of the body. The 5 ranch hands, rough men who had spent weeks living on stale bacon and bitter coffee, were wary at first. They came in from the bunkhouse for their meals, stamping snow from their boots, their eyes curious and guarded. They ate the first meal a thick beef stew with root vegetables and 3 kinds of bread in near silence. By the second day, the silence was broken. One of the men, a wiry cowboy named Jed, told a story about a stubborn mule, and another man laughed. It was a rusty sound in the big house, but it was a start. Rose's cooking was not just food. It was a message. It spoke of care, of effort, of a world that was not just about survival, but about living. The men's faces lost their gaunt, wind-burned look. They worked harder, their movements more energetic as they dug out the paths to the spring and tended to the snowbound cattle in the barn. The efficiency of the ranch, Samuel Hayes noted with his usual quiet observation, had increased by a measurable amount. Elias, the boy, was the first to be truly transformed. With 3 full meals a day, his face began to fill out, and the blue, pinched look left his eyes. He appointed himself Rose's chief assistant, hauling wood, scrubbing potatoes, his former terror replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty to the woman who fed him. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the clatter of pots, the rhythmic thud of Elias's chopping, and the occasional, hesitant sound of laughter from the men's table. The kitchen fire had become the center of their small, isolated world. When the storm finally broke, revealing a world sculpted in white and blue, the silence of the mountain was replaced by the noise of the town. News, like water, always finds a way to flow. Luther Pike's visit had been the first crack in the dam. The gossip that erupted in Gallows Ridge was more vicious than the storm. It was not just about Rose Whitaker, the plain spinster, living in sin with the mountain man. That was only the start. The town, fueled by Pike's whispers, began to weave a larger, darker story. It was about Samuel Hayes and his known association with the Cheyenne. It was about Red Hawk, who was seen as a threat to the mine's progress. "He keeps a woman up there he did not marry," was the talk in the mercantile. "And he keeps company with savages," was the reply on the saloon porch. "Man's gone native. Always said so. Now he's got a white woman, shaming her, shaming the whole town." The racial lines were drawn, a way to isolate Samuel and, by extension, to justify what was coming. Red Hawk arrived on the 5th day, his pony moving silently on the snow-packed trail. He did not come to the house, but waited for Samuel by the line of pines that marked the edge of the ranch. Rose, watching from the kitchen window, saw the two men talking. Samuel was standing, but Red Hawk was crouched, drawing lines in the snow. Their conversation was long and low. When Samuel returned to the house, his face was carved from granite. He did not speak of it at dinner, but later, as Rose was banking the fire for the night and Elias was asleep on his cot near the stove. Samuel spoke. "Pike is moving his line," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Rose paused, her hand on the iron stove lid. His line. "For the ore road, from the mine to the flatlands, where the railroad is supposed to come." He pointed out the dark window. "Toward the unseen valley. He plans to cut across the South Meadows. But that is where the Cheyenne hunt. Is it not?" Rose knew this from the talk she had heard, the complaints from the miners about the land being wasted. "It is more than that," Samuel said, his voice flat. "It is their wintering ground, and it is where their ancestors are buried. He is planning to run his wagon straight through their burial ground." Rose felt a cold deeper than the snow. "He cannot. Can he? Surely there is a law." Samuel gave a short, harsh laugh. "Pike is the law in Gallows Ridge. He sees land. He takes it. He sees people. He uses them. Or he breaks them." He looked at her then, his gaze direct. "Red Hawk knows Pike is doing this to force a fight. If the Cheyenne raise a hand to protect their dead, Pike will call it an uprising. He will bring in the cavalry. And he will get his road." The muddle of social prejudice, land rights, and outright greed was tightening into a knot. The winter storm had passed, but the real one was just beginning. 2 days later, the ranch was running low on salt, coffee, and, to Rose's dismay, baking soda. The trip to town could not be put off. "I will go," Samuel said. "No," Rose said, surprising herself with the force of her own voice. "If you go, Pike's men will try to provoke you, and the town will talk more. It is just supplies. Elias and I can go. We will be in and out before noon." Samuel considered it. Her logic was sound. A woman buying flour was normal. A mountain man coming to town was a confrontation. Elias knows how to handle the wagon. Stay clear of the saloon. Go only to the mercantile. The ride down was cold, but the sky was a brilliant, sharp blue. Elias handled the reins of the smaller buckboard wagon with a practiced skill, his chest puffed with the responsibility. Gallows Ridge looked different. The snow had softened its hard edges, but the stares of the people had grown sharper. When Rose stepped down from the wagon in front of the mercantile, the street went quiet. It was the same quiet that had fallen in the market, but this time it was not curiosity. It was judgment. The men on the saloon porch stopped talking. The women gathering by the dressmaker's shop turned as one, their faces hard. Rose ignored them, took her list, and walked inside, Elias trailing behind her like a small guard. Mr. Henderson, the mercantile owner, who had always been polite, suddenly could not meet her eye. He busily restocked a shelf, his back to her. "Just leave the list on the counter. Miss Whitaker, I will get to it." Rose placed the list down. As she waited, the whispers from the street grew louder, bold enough to come through the door. "That is her, the one living with Hayes. Shameful. And with that little orphan boy, too. What kind of life is that for a child?" Then the bell above the door jangled, and the cold air swept in, bringing Mrs. Dalton with it. The landlady stopped dead when she saw Rose, her face a mask of righteous fury. "So, Mrs. Dalton said, her voice carrying across the store, "you have landed on your feet, I see, or perhaps on your back." The store went utterly silent. "Mr. Henderson froze, a can of peaches in his hand. Rose felt the blood drain from her face. "Mrs. Dalton, I am here on business." "Business, Mrs." Dalton scoffed. "I am sure it is. The business of a woman living under the roof of a wild man. A man who prefers savages to decent folk. Tell me, Miss Whitaker, what is the price for that kind of living? Does he pay you more than the $6 you cheated him out of for that bread?" "I am not," Rose began, her voice trembling. "You are a disgrace." "Mrs." Dalton said, stepping closer. "A disgrace to Gallows Ridge and a disgrace to all decent women." "Leave her be," a small voice squeaked. Elias had stepped out from behind Rose, his small fists clenched. "She is a good lady. She makes us food." "Mrs." Dalton looked down at the boy as if he were an insect. "And you are a vagrant, living on her scraps. You are all of a kind." "That is enough. Mrs. Dalton." Rose's voice was quiet, but it cut through the woman's tirade. Rose was shaking, not with fear, but with an anger so cold it burned. She placed her coins on the counter. "Mr. Henderson, I will take my supplies." She gathered her bags, her head held high, and walked out of the store, Elias at her heels. The walk back to the wagon felt a mile long. Every eye on the street a tiny, sharp stone. The ride back up the mountain was silent. Elias's small, angry tears had frozen on his cheeks. Rose just stared at the road, the words "wild man" and "savages" echoing in her head. That night, Samuel was in the barn, and the ranch hands were in the bunkhouse. Rose was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot with a fury that had not yet faded. Red Hawk appeared at the kitchen door. He did not knock, but his presence was a quiet question. "May I enter, baker woman?" he asked, his English precise. Rose startled, her hand slipping. "Yes, please." He stepped inside, but only just over the threshold. He held something in his hand. "The town was not kind to you today. You heard. The wind carries ugly words faster than good ones." He looked at her. "They call us savages because we honor the land. They call your man wild because he respects us. They are afraid." "What they are," Rose said, her voice bitter, "is cruel." "Cruel is the tool of the weak," Red Hawk said. He held out his hand. In his palm was a small, intricately beaded leather pouch. "My people, we share salt, to show our hearts are open, to show we are one family, under the one sky. It is a ceremony of truth." He placed the pouch on the table. "I would invite you to our fires, to share our salt." Rose looked at the pouch. It was a gesture of profound trust, a bridge offered across a chasm of hatred. I am not." "You are a woman of the fire," he said. "Like us. You make life from grain. You feed a small, lost boy. We see this. We honor this." He then said a word in Cheyenne, a soft, flowing word. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means, she who feeds us." He said, "It is what Elias told my cousin you are called." Rose felt tears prick her eyes. The first she had allowed herself. "I cannot share salt," she said, her voice thick, "but I can share bread." She went to the pantry and brought out a fresh loaf of sourdough, still slightly warm. "Please, take this to your people, as a sign of respect." Red Hawk took the bread, his expression unreadable, but for a light in his eyes. "You learn our laws quickly. Baker woman, the law of fairness, a gift for a gift." He left as silently as he had come. Rose stood by the kitchen table, looking at the small pouch. The lines were being drawn tighter. In town, the conflict was also hardening. In the Silver Slipper Saloon, Luther Pike was buying a round of drinks. "That land is worthless," he was saying, his voice booming across the smoke-filled room. "Nigh on useless for grazing. And the Cheyenne only wanted to keep progress out. That ore road is the lifeblood of this town." "What about Hayes?" one of his men asked. The question pitched for the crowd. "He is thick as thieves with Red Hawk." "Hayes is a broken-down relic," Pike said, waving a dismissive hand. "Playing house with a spinster and some Indian-loving boy. He is no threat." "I heard Red Hawk threatened your surveyors," another man said. "He did," Pike said, his voice dropping, becoming serious. "And that is why I cannot stand for it. This is not about land anymore. This is about safety, about protecting our homes, our property." He pulled the sheriff, a man named Brady who owed Pike more than his salary, into the center of the room. "Sheriff, I am formally requesting a writ, a legal order, to protect the property of the Gallows Ridge mine against any and all threats, be they from man or savage." The sheriff, his face slick with sweat, nodded. "You will have it, Mr. Pike. You will have it by morning. We will protect this town's assets." The trap was being set. The winter, which had seemed like a truce, was only a pause to sharpen the knives. The high, thin whine of the wind returned. It had been a week since Rose's trip to Gallows Ridge, a week of brittle, cold sunlight. But the mountain knew what was coming. The cattle, which had been grazing on the exposed patches of grass on the lower slopes, began to move on their own, grouping together near the big barn, their backs to the north wind. "A big one is coming. Jed, the senior ranch hand, said to Rose, his breath pluming in the kitchen air. "The stock can smell it. They always know." Samuel Hayes had been watching the sky, a narrow, greenish-gray line that had appeared on the horizon. He said nothing, but his actions spoke. He ordered the men to double-check the barn roof and reinforce the snow breaks. He asked Rose to do a full inventory of the pantry. "We may be shut in for a week. Rose," he said, his voice practical, "cook as if we are. Bake bread for reserve. Assume we will have 10 mouths to feed." 10, she asked, counting herself. Samuel, Elias, and the 5 hands. That was 8. "Red Hawk may send his elders," he said, and offered no more explanation. Rose nodded and began her preparations. The kitchen became a warm, bustling center of activity. She started massive pots of beans and stew base, letting them simmer down. She and Elias baked loaf after loaf of bread, stacking them in the cold pantry, where they would freeze solid but remain fresh. She made hardtack, a food she despised but respected for its endurance. Elias, brimming with his self-appointed role as head of wood supply, was given a strict order by Samuel. "The wind is rising. Boy, you chop wood. You stay within sight of the kitchen window. Do not go past the pine line. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Hayes," Elias said, saluting with his small axe. Rose watched him from the window. A small, determined figure attacking the woodpile. He was safe. He was warm. He was fed. While the ranch prepared for the storm, Red Hawk was dealing with a different kind of invasion. He rode the line of his valley, the sacred land, and found what he had been dreading. They were new, freshly driven wooden stakes, painted red, hammered deep into the frozen earth, but they were not on the edge of the meadows. They were deep inside, a full half-mile past the traditional line, cutting a path straight toward the quiet, snow-covered mounds of the ancestral burial ground. He sat on his pony, his face a mask of cold fury. This was not a survey error. This was a deliberate, calculated insult. This was Luther Pike spitting on his grandfather's graves. It was a provocation, designed for one purpose: to make him angry, to make him draw blood. He knew, with a sick certainty, that Pike's men were likely watching from a high ridge, waiting, hoping for a Cheyenne warrior to attack a defenseless survey stake. An attack would be the excuse Pike needed to bring in the sheriff and his new writ of protection. Red Hawk did not touch the stakes. He wheeled his pony and rode, not back to his village, but up the high path toward Samuel Hayes's ranch. The next day, the wind had not yet peaked, but the sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of lead. Rose realized she was almost out of flour. The baking reserves had taken the last of it. "I must go to town," she told Samuel. "We cannot face a week-long storm without flour." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I will go." "No," Rose said, just as she had before. "It is worse now. After what Dalton said. After what Pike said, your going is a challenge. My going is just an errand. Elias and I will be quick. We will just go to the mercantile." He argued, but she was firm. She was the cook. This was her domain. She would not let the ranch run out of bread. He finally relented, his eyes dark with worry. "Take the strong wagon. And Jed, I want a man with you." "No," Rose said, her stubbornness surprising them both. "A man with a gun is a target. It makes us look afraid, or looking for a fight. Elias and I, it is broad daylight. We are buying flour." The trip down was fast. The wagon light, the horses sensing the coming storm and eager to return. But the atmosphere in Gallows Ridge had changed from quiet judgment to open hostility. As Rose walked toward the mercantile, her basket on her arm, a group of women, led by Mrs. Dalton, blocked the boardwalk. "Well, look who it is. Mrs. Dalton said, her voice like ice. "Come down from her mountain nest. Come to spend her lover's money on decent folk." The other women laughed, a high, cruel sound. "I am here to buy flour. Mrs. Dalton," Rose said, her voice level. She tried to step around them. "Flour? Is it?" another woman sneered. "Or maybe you are buying pretty things. Does he like you in lace, Miss Whitaker? Or does the savage lover prefer you in rags?" Rose stopped. She looked at the faces, twisted with a spite that was almost gleeful. "Let me pass, please." "She is asking nicely." "Mrs. Dalton mocked. "Go back to your mountain. Harlot, we do not want your kind in g-g—" The woman was so filled with hate. She stammered, "We do not want you here." From the edge of the group, a young boy, encouraged by his mother's laughter, scooped a handful of wet, black mud from the street. He ran forward and threw it. It struck Rose's basket, splattering her dress and the clean cloth she had laid over the top. Elias, who had been waiting by the wagon, let out a yell of rage and ran forward, but Rose's voice stopped him. "Elias, stay." He froze, his small face torn. Rose did not look at the mud. She did not wipe her dress. She stood, her back straight as a pine, and looked directly into Mrs. Dalton's eyes. She held the gaze for a full 5 seconds, her own eyes clear and filled with a cold, quiet dignity that was more powerful than their insults. The women's laughter faltered. They had expected tears, or curses. They did not know what to do with this silence, this strength. "I am here," a deep voice said from behind them, "to buy flour." Samuel Hayes was there. He had followed them. He had been watching from the alley by the blacksmith. He walked not around the women, but through them, his size and his cold fury making them scatter like chickens. He stopped in front of Mr. Henderson, who had come to the mercantile doorway. "Henderson," Samuel said, his voice a low growl that carried across the street. "How much flour do you have?" I have 10 sacks. "Mr. Hayes, a new shipment just came in." "I will take all of them." All 10, sir." and 2 sacks of salt, 1 of sugar, and a case of coffee. Samuel pulled a heavy leather purse from his coat and threw it on the boardwalk. It landed with a heavy, final thud of coin. He then turned, his gaze sweeping over the silent, stunned women. He looked at Rose, at the mud on her dress. He gestured to her, his voice ringing out for the entire street to hear. "This ranch," he said, his voice clear and hard, "eats because of this woman. Her work feeds my men. Her work keeps my ranch running. This is the woman who keeps us alive." He turned back to Henderson. "Load it on my wagon, now." He had not defended her honor. He had not called her a lady. He had, in front of the entire town, declared her a master of her craft. He had given her value, not as a woman, but as a worker, a provider. He had pushed back against their judgment with the only currency he recognized: labor. The walk back to the wagon was different. The town was silent, but it was the silence of confusion, of a narrative that had just been stolen from them. The ride back up the mountain was thick with unspoken words. The wind was howling now, a rising scream, and the first flakes of snow, hard as sand, began to drive against them. That night, the house was sealed. The wind slammed against the logs like a physical fist. The world was a screaming white void. They ate dinner in the main room, the kitchen fire and the great hearth both roaring. Jed and the hands, Samuel, Rose, and Elias. They were a small island of life in the storm. After the meal, as Rose and Elias were clearing the plates, Samuel stared into the fire. Suddenly, Elias, who was at the window, trying to see the storm, let out a gasp. "Mr. Hayes, look on the ridge." Samuel was at the window in an instant. Rose joined him. On the far ridge, across the canyon, visible even through the driving snow, were 3 lights, small, flickering fires, set in a triangle. They flared, died, and flared again. "What is it?" Rose whispered. "A signal," Samuel said, his voice grim. "Cheyenne. It means the enemy is in the valley. Not the storm. Men." "Pike's men." "At the burial ground," Samuel said. "Red Hawk was right." As if summoned, a heavy knock came at the main door, a sound that should not have been possible in this storm. Samuel unbarred it. Red Hawk stood there, a ghost covered in ice, his face impassive. He stepped inside, bringing the storm with him. "They are there," he said, without greeting. "They are digging." "In this?" Rose asked, horrified. "In this storm?" "They use the storm as a cloak," Red Hawk said. "They dig for the bones of our grandfathers, to show their disrespect, to force the fight." "It is a trap, Red Hawk," Samuel said. "You know it." "It is," Red Hawk agreed. "Which is why we do not fight. Not tonight." He looked at Samuel. "We hold a council. Now, they have broken the law of the earth. We must use the white man's law against them." He turned. "I have brought 2 elders. They wait in your barn. They will not come in unless you invite them. This is your land." "This house," Samuel said, and he looked at Rose for a brief second, "is neutral ground. You are welcome here. Your elders are welcome here." Red Hawk nodded. "We will talk, and," he looked at Rose, "we will need a witness, one who is not Cheyenne, one who is not a mountain man, one who feeds and does not fight." "Me," Rose whispered. "You," he confirmed. This was the new threshold. She was no longer just the cook. She was being asked to be a part of this, to stand on one side of a line. While the men went to the barn, Rose put the great coffee pot on the fire. She brought out the reserve bread, a council. She would feed a council. It was then that she realized she had not seen Elias for 20 minutes. "Elias," she called, looking in his usual spot by the stove. He was not there. "Elias," she called, louder, her voice rising in panic. She ran to the kitchen door. The wood box, which he had been filling, was half empty. The door itself was slightly ajar, a small drift of snow already forming on the floor. "Samuel, Her voice was a scream. "Samuel, he is gone!" Samuel ran from the main room, his face a mask of disbelief. "What?" "The wood. He went out for wood. He did not come back." Samuel grabbed his heaviest coat, his face pale beneath his beard. He went past the line, into the pines. The wind. He is lost. The wind shrieked, rattling the windows. It was no longer a storm. It was a monster. This was the threshold, the one she had stood at in the market, in the cold, by the broken cart. "Wait, or search. Stay inside, or go out." "I am going with you," Rose said, grabbing her own worn coat. "You will not," Samuel commanded. "You do not know the path. You will die." "He is my boy," she cried, the words torn from her. "He is my—" She stopped, but the truth was out. She grabbed a lantern from the mantel and a coil of heavy rope from a peg by the door. Samuel looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, a mirror of the fire in the hearth. He saw a strength that matched the mountain. He did not argue again. He snatched another lantern. "Stay behind me. Hold the rope. Do not, for any reason, let go." They opened the door and stepped out of the house, out of the small, warm circle of light, and into the screaming, white heart of the blizzard. The moment the heavy door was flung open, the storm did not just enter. It invaded. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of sound and ice that extinguished the warmth of the room. Samuel had tied the heavy rope around his own waist, and then, with a rough gentleness, around Rose's, he held the lantern, but it was a pathetic, tiny circle of light, instantly swallowed by the screaming white. Elias Samuel's voice was a roar, but the wind tore the name from his mouth and shredded it. "Stay behind me. Keep the rope taut." Rose did not need to be told. She clutched the rope with both hands, her head down, her thin coat instantly penetrated by the stinging, needle-like snow. She was not walking. She was being pulled, a dead weight on the line, into a world that had no up, no down, no direction. It was a void of noise and force. Elias, she tried to scream, but the wind filled her mouth, stealing her breath. This was not weather. It was a living, malicious thing. They stumbled past the corner of the house. Samuel knew the path to the woodpile by instinct, but even his instinct was failing. The snow was knee-deep, then thigh-deep in drifts, a thick, smothering quicksand of ice. The lantern cast a frantic, useless glow, illuminating nothing but the churning wall of white in front of their faces. "I cannot see the line," Samuel bellowed. Stopping, he had turned his head, and Rose, attached to him, stumbled into his back. The pines, I cannot see them. Panic, colder than the ice, seized Rose. He was lost. The mountain man was lost, 10 yards from his own door. "Elias," she shrieked, a sound of pure terror. She pulled back on the rope, desperate, and held her own lantern higher. It was her lantern, the one from her own coat, that caught it. Not a track, not a path, a shadow, a darkness in the white. "Samuel, there," she cried, pointing, "the woodpile to the right." It was a darker shape in the maelstrom. Samuel lunged toward it. He fell to his knees, his hands sweeping, his voice a low, desperate prayer. "He is not here," he roared. He must have gone back." No, Rose knew, with a mother's certainty. She pulled the rope, moving past him, holding her light low to the ground. She was not a mountain tracker, but she was a keeper of details. She knew every inch of this small yard. The wind, he would have gone behind it here. She plunged her hand into a drift, just beside the woodpile, in the lee of the chopping block. Her glove hit something. It was not snow, it was not wood. It was small and hard and frozen. It was the back of Elias's boot. Here she screamed, digging with her bare hands, the cold searing her skin. Samuel was beside her in an instant. He plunged his arms into the drift and, with a sound that was not human, a sound of pure, primal grief, he pulled. The small, frozen shape of Elias came free. He was curled tight, his small axe still clutched in his frozen hand. He was a small, solid block of ice, his face a waxy blue, his eyelashes caked in white. For a single, horrific second, they both stared. He was not breathing. Then Samuel acted. He tore open his massive buffalo coat. He did not try to revive the boy in the storm. He pulled the frozen child to his own chest, shoving him deep against his own skin and wool undershirt. He wrapped the coat around the boy, creating a small, dark cocoon of his own body heat. The lantern he roared at Rose. The wind chose that moment to gust, and Rose's light flickered, threatening to die. "No!" she screamed. She turned her back to the wind, crouching over the lantern, shielding the glass chimney with her own body. She protected the small, guttering flame as if it were the boy's life itself. Back to the house move. Samuel was on his feet, the boy a lump against his chest. They had gone 10 feet when Samuel slipped. A patch of ice, hidden beneath the new snow, stole his footing. He went down, a crash of a great tree, his entire weight landing on his right shoulder. He twisted as he fell, a violent, desperate contortion, ensuring he landed on the rock-hard ground and not on the precious, fragile bundle inside his coat. Rose was yanked from her feet by the rope, landing hard beside him. The lantern flew from her hand, its light extinguished, plunging them into absolute, roaring darkness. "Samuel," she screamed, her voice breaking. "The rope, I have the rope," he gasped. He was in agony, but he was already pushing himself up. "Find me! Follow the rope!" He was up, staggering, pulling her with him. He was a blind man, moving on pure memory, hauling her through the screaming white. They found the wall of the house, slammed into it, and fumbled their way to the door. He kicked the door open, and they fell inside, collapsing onto the wood floor, bringing the storm and the snow and the darkness in with them. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and their own ragged, desperate breathing. Red Hawk and the 2 Cheyenne elders were by the hearth. They had not moved. Their dark, ancient eyes had watched the door fly open. They saw everything. Samuel was on his knees, fumbling with his coat, his face a mask of terror. "He is not—" He pulled Elias out. The boy was limp, his skin a shocking, pale blue. Red Hawk was on his feet. "Not by the fire. Hayes, you will burn him. The cold bucket. Now." But Rose was already in command. This was her world. The kitchen, the hearth, the world of healing. Her hands were shaking so hard she could not unbutton her own coat, but her voice was steel. "Jed," she screamed, knowing the ranch hands in the bunkhouse would never hear. She turned to the elders. "Water, a bucket of snow. Now, and blankets. Get blankets from the trunk. Put them by the fire to warm, not on him by the fire." The ancient men moved, their movements sudden and precise. Rose grabbed her sewing shears from her basket and cut the frozen, ragged clothes from Elias's body. She was throwing the icy rags into the corner as Red Hawk returned with a wooden bucket of fresh, dry snow. "Rub him," Rose commanded, her voice shaking but firm. She and Samuel, his face ashen, his right arm hanging limp at his side, began to rub the boy's frozen limbs. They rubbed until the blue skin turned a waxy white, and then a frightening, mottled red. "Warm water now? Not hot, just warm," Rose ordered. She was running a maze of healing, her mind far ahead of her fear. They worked for an hour. They submerged his hands and feet in basins of lukewarm water, a process that was agonizing for the boy, though he was still unconscious. They rubbed his chest. Rose, seeing the boy's lips were cracked, spooned a tiny bit of lukewarm, weak broth between them. Elias coughed. It was a small, dry, rattling sound. The entire room froze. He coughed again, and his eyes flickered open. They were milky, unfocused. He whimpered, a thin animal sound of pain as the life and the feeling flowed back into his frozen body. "He is alive," Rose whispered, and she began to cry, not with sounds, but with silent, heavy tears that froze on her cheeks in the cold air of the room. Samuel Hayes leaned back against the wall, his own legs giving out. He slid to the floor, his face buried in his one good hand. Later, much later, the storm still raged, but the house was quiet. The Cheyenne elders, having seen the crisis pass, were dozing by the fire, wrapped in their own blankets. Elias was asleep, truly asleep, buried under a mountain of warm wool, his breathing shallow but even. He was tucked into the alcove cot that had first been offered to Rose. Rose was in the kitchen, her hands finally still. Red Hawk had stepped out onto the porch, a silent, solitary guardian against the storm. His own counsel delayed by the fight for a small boy's life. Samuel sat at the massive plank table in the main room, his head bowed. Rose came out of the kitchen. She carried a basin of water, clean linen strips, and a bottle of whiskey. He did not look up. She set the basin on the table. "You are hurt, Samuel." "It is nothing," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Let me be the judge of that." Her voice was quiet, but it held the same authority she had used to save the boy. "Take off your shirt." He hesitated. To be tended to be seen. It was a language he had forgotten. He slowly, painfully, tried to pull the heavy wool shirt over his head, but his right arm would not obey. He gritted his teeth, a low sound of pain and frustration. Rose took her shears and, without a word, cut the shirt from his body, laying it open at the collar. The skin of his shoulder and collarbone was a grotesque map of black and purple, a massive, swollen bruise. A piece of rock, from his fall, had broken the skin near his neck. She said nothing. She dipped the cloth in the warm water and began to clean the wound. His skin was hot. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath. But it was not from the pain. It was from the touch. Her hands, calloused from work but impossibly gentle, moved over his skin. She cleaned the cut, her touch methodical and sure. She poured a little whiskey on a clean cloth and pressed it to the wound. He hissed, his entire body going rigid, but he did not pull away. She worked in silence, bandaging his shoulder, wrapping the linen tight to keep the swelling down. The intimacy of the act was so profound it was almost unbearable. It was not desire, it was deeper. It was care. It was the simple, human act of mending. "I lost one," he said, his voice so low she almost did not hear it. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the floor. Rose paused, her hand still on the bandage. "My son, he was 5. His voice was dead, a recitation of a fact he had worn smooth with time. We were crossing the Gray Bull in the spring. The water was high. The horse, he stumbled. I had the boy in the saddle, right in front of me. I held him, but the current took the horse. I held on. I held him until my arms broke. But I survived. He did not." He closed his eyes. "I was supposed to be the strong one, the one who knew the mountains. And I came out of the water. He did not." The story of the rocking horse, the survivor's guilt that had frozen his heart, long before the storm. Rose finished tying the knot on the bandage. Her hand, her rough, bread-making hand, rested on the clean white cloth, over the heart of his pain. The warmth of her palm soaked through the linen. "You did not lose this one, Samuel," she whispered. He did not move, but a single, hard shudder ran through his body. On the porch, Red Hawk stood, looking out into the white chaos. He had heard the confession. He had felt the change in the house, the storm of grief. The one that had lived in this house for years had finally broken. A small, weak sound came from the alcove. "Sir." Elias was awake. His eyes were open, clear, but hazy with fever. He was looking at the man by the table. Samuel turned, his body stiff with pain, his heart raw. Elias's small hand came out from under the blankets, reaching, his face pale and thin, was filled with a sleepy, absolute trust. "Pa," he whispered. The word was a gunshot in the quiet room. Samuel froze. His face, which had faced the storm, which had faced his own ghosts, was shattered. He could not move. He could not breathe. Rose, by the table, held her breath. The small hand was still reaching. Slowly, as if lifting a 1,000-pound weight, Samuel Hayes raised his one good arm. He crossed the space between them and, with his large, scarred hand, he gently took the small, feverish one. He held it. He did not speak. The boy's eyes closed, and he slipped back into a healing sleep, his hand held fast. The family, this strange, broken, working family, had chosen each other. Red Hawk stepped back inside, his face grim, the cold air swirling in with him. The moment was over. "They are still out there," he said, his voice a low growl. The two elders were awake, their faces grave. "The lights. I saw them again. Pike's men, they are using the storm to dig. They are stealing the bones of our ancestors." He looked at Samuel, and his gaze was different. He was no longer looking at a simple ally. He was looking at a man he now understood. "When this storm breaks, they will be gone, but their tracks will not be. I will stop them. Hayes, not with a rifle, but in your town, with your laws. You saw the lights. You are my witness." This woman he nodded to, Rose, she is a witness. "You will stand with me at the town court. You will tell them what you saw." The storm broke on a Saturday. By Sunday morning, the valley was a blinding, pristine white, the sky a painful, brilliant blue. The silence was absolute. After the chaos of the blizzard, the quiet felt heavy, like a held breath. Elias was recovering. He was weak, his fingers and toes tender, but he was alive, and he had not left Rose's side, his eyes following her with a quiet, fierce devotion. Samuel's shoulder was a deep, agonizing purple, but he moved with a grim determination, his left arm doing the work of two. They knew they had to go to town, not just for Red Hawk, but for themselves. The silence of the mountain was one thing. The silence of Gallows Ridge would be another. The church bell was ringing, a thin, tinny sound in the vast, snowy expanse. It was the only sound in town. They arrived late, Samuel, Rose, and Elias. They did not take the wagon. Samuel had insisted on the large freight sleigh, a more solid and imposing presence. When they pushed open the heavy oak doors of the small church, the singing stopped. The building was packed. It was the only warm, public place in town, and the entire population of Gallows Ridge was there, seeking warmth, seeking community, seeking the next target for their judgment. The sermon, being delivered by a nervous young preacher, faltered. Every eye turned to the back row. They saw the mountain man, his right arm bound in a white sling. They saw the plain, ruined woman, her head held high, and they saw the orphan boy, clutching her hand. They looked, Rose thought, like a strange, broken set of refugees. They found 3 spaces on the back pew and sat. The sermon stumbled, stopped, and started again. But the preacher's words were lost. The real sermon was about to begin, as the final hymn died. And before the preacher could give his blessing, Mrs. Dalton stood up. Her black dress was a column of pure spite. "Preacher," she said, her voice ringing in the cold air, "before we are dismissed, I feel the Lord's house must be cleansed. There is a moral sickness in this town, a rot that has been allowed to fester." She turned, her finger pointing not at the saloon, not at the gamblers, but directly at the back pew. "We sit here, praying for deliverance. While sin sits among us, we have a woman, a so-called woman, who has abandoned all decency, who leaves the protection of this town to live in sin with a man who is not her husband, a wild man, a savage lover." A low, agreeing murmur rippled through the pews. People who had known Rose for years, who had bought her bread, turned to stare, their faces hard with righteousness. She pollutes our town. She corrupts the innocent misses. Dalton's voice rose, trembling with her own power. And she brings that pollution, that orphan, into the house of God, I say. Cast them out, cast out the sin, and cleanse this house. Cast them out, someone shouted from the front. Rose's face was white. She felt Elias tremble, and she pulled him closer. She looked at the floor, the faces of the townsfolk a blur of hatred. Samuel Hayes sat for a long moment. He looked at Rose, at her bowed head. He looked at Elias, who was trying to hide behind her. Then he looked at the congregation. Slowly, painfully, he stood up. He used his one good arm to brace himself on the pew in front of him. He was a large man, and his shadow, cast by the winter light from the windows, fell over the entire center aisle. The church went utterly, completely silent. "Mrs. Dalton," Samuel Hayes said, his voice not loud, but a low, deep rumble that filled the church to its rafters. "You speak of sin." He took a step into the aisle. "I will tell you of this woman's sin. For 3 weeks, she has risen at 4 o'clock in the morning. She has built a fire and she has baked bread. She has cooked hot meals for 5 working men, men who keep this town supplied with beef. That is her first sin." He took another step. The preacher looked like he wanted to intervene, but he was frozen. "Her second sin," Samuel continued, his voice cutting through the silence, "is that when I brought a half-dead, starving orphan boy to my door. She did not turn him away. She fed him. She washed his clothes. She has taught him his letters. She has saved his life. That is the sin of her compassion." He was in the middle of the aisle now, his one good arm hanging at his side, his bandaged one a stark white against his dark coat. "Her third sin, Mrs. Dalton, is the greatest. 3 nights ago, in a blizzard that would have killed any of us, this woman, this small, ruined woman, tied a rope around her waist. She went out into that storm, into that white hell, to find that same boy when he was lost. She found him. She pulled him from the snow. She warmed his frozen body with her own hands. She fought death in my kitchen, and she won." He looked around the room, his gaze landing on every man, every woman. "If you call cooking for hungry men a sin," he said, his voice dropping, "if you call saving a child from starvation a sin, if you call risking your own life to save another a sin, then I pray to God that this sin finds its way into every home in this valley, because we are all freezing to death without it." He stood there, a mountain of a man, vulnerable, his pain clear for all to see. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was loud. It was the sound of shame. It was the sound of 100 people suddenly seeing their own small, cold hearts. "Mrs." Dalton's face had crumpled, her mouth open, no words coming out. Men who had been whispering in the saloon looked down at their boots. Women who had sneered at Rose now fiddled with their gloves. Into that silence, Luther Pike stood up. He was clapping. It was a slow, deliberate, mocking clap. "A fine speech." "Hayes," Pike said, his voice booming with false heartiness. "Truly, you have missed your calling. You should have been a preacher, not a hermit." He smiled, a wide, predator's smile, as he took control of the room. "We are all very moved. A woman's work, a child saved. It is a beautiful story, but it does not feed the town. It does not protect us." He turned to the preacher. "I have news that makes this domestic drama seem rather small. While we were praying, my men found what was left of the old granary by the south meadows. It was burned to the ground. Last night, in the storm." A gasp went through the room. The granary held the winter reserve for the town's horses. "Burned," the preacher stammered. "By Red Hawk," Pike said, his voice flat and certain. His tracks were everywhere, a clear message. He does not just want the land. He wants to starve us out. He is threatening our very lives. The room exploded. The shame was gone, replaced by a hotter, more useful emotion, fear. "He is lying," Rose said, her voice sharp. She was on her feet, her face pale but furious. "Red Hawk was at our house. He was warning us. He was with his elders." "At your house," Pike said, his voice full of false pity. "Of course he was. Child. He was your lover's friend, hiding while his men did his dirty work." "He is not a liar," Rose cried, but her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of panic. "We must form a militia," one of the miners shouted. "The sheriff. Where is Brady? He has the writ. He can arrest them." Samuel Hayes watched, his face grim. He had won the battle, but Pike had just won the war. He had turned the town's opinion in a single, brilliant, false stroke. Samuel put his good hand on Rose's arm. "Not here," he said, his voice low. "We are leaving." He walked them out, Elias between them, his good arm resting on the boy's shoulder. The congregation parted for them, their faces no longer shamed, but fearful and angry. The ride back to the ranch was heavy. "He is not just digging up bones," Samuel said, his voice bitter. "He is burying the truth." "They will listen to him," Rose said, her hands twisting in her lap. "They are afraid, and he gave them someone to blame." "He will not win," Samuel said. How Rose cried, "He has the town, he has the sheriff, he has a lie. What do we have? We have a pot of beans and a healed boy." "Then we will use what we have," she said, her voice changing. The panic was gone, replaced by a sudden, hard clarity. The clarity of the stove, the clarity of the storm. "Samuel, what if we fed them, all of them?" He looked at her. "What?" "The town, they are afraid, they are angry. What Pike did was throw meat to wolves. What if we offer them bread instead, a public meal, at the ranch? We invite everyone, to show we have nothing to hide, to show that our fire is for warming, not burning. We let them see Elias healed. We let them see your men fed. We let them see us." Samuel stared at her. It was insane. It was brilliant. "They will not come," he said. "They will," she said. "They are hungry, and they are curious, and we will make it a feast, a peace offering, made of flour and beef." He was silent for a long time. "It is a risk, Rose." "So is doing nothing," she replied. He looked at the long, snow-covered road. He was a man of walls, of closed doors. She was asking him to open the main gate. He nodded. "Once. All right. Baker woman. We will feed the town." Red Hawk arrived that night. He was wary. "It is a trick. Hayes, Pike will use it." "He is already using everything," Samuel said. "This is Rose's plan. A council of food." Red Hawk looked at Rose, and his gaze was long. "The Baker woman's fire. It is a strong weapon. But Pike's fire is hot. Be ready." The night before the feast, the kitchen was a wondrous, chaotic place. The ranch hands, caught up in Rose's fervor, were peeling potatoes. Elias was polishing every cup and plate. The smell of roasting beef, of baking bread, of simmering pies, filled the house. Samuel was standing in the doorway, his arm in its sling, watching. He was not a man of words, and what he felt was a strange, unfamiliar thing. It was not the cold grief he had lived with. It was not the empty silence. It was warm. Rose came from the pantry, her arms full of spice jars, her face flushed with heat and exertion, a streak of flour on her cheek. She stopped when she saw him, her and the load blocking the doorway. "You are in my way." "Mr. Hayes," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I know. He said he did not move. He looked at the flour on her cheek. You have something." "I am sure I do," she said. "It is a kitchen, not a church." He reached up with his good hand, his left hand, and his fingers, calloused and rough, gently brushed the flour from her skin. His touch lingered, his thumb moving over the high bone of her cheek. The kitchen, with its noise and its warmth, faded. There was only the sound of the fire and the small, still space between them. She looked up at him, her muddy water eyes clear and deep. He was not the town's mountain man. He was not the town's savage lover. He was just Samuel, the man who had held her hand in the storm, the man who had stood for her in the church. "Thank you, Samuel," she whispered, and it was for everything. For the bread, for the ride, for the speech. "It was you, Rose," he said, his voice thick. "It was always you." He leaned down, slowly, his movement painful for his shoulder, but he did not stop. He was giving her time to turn away. She did not turn. She rose on her toes, just slightly, and met him. His lips were not soft. They were chapped and tasted of coffee in the cold mountain air. It was not a kiss of passion or fire. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was a kiss of thanks. It was a kiss that said, "You are home." It was slow, and it was short, and it was a promise. He pulled back, his eyes dark. A small, polite cough came from the pantry. They sprang apart, or tried to. Rose dropped the spice tins, which clattered to the floor. Elias was standing there, his face a mask of polite indifference. "I just needed the polishing cloths. Rose, for the forks." He made a great show of finding the cloths, his back to them. Rose looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Rose. Their faces were a mirror of guilt and surprise, and something else. A low chuckle started in Samuel's chest. It was a rusty sound, a sound he had not made in years. It turned into a full, deep laugh. Rose, seeing his face, his real face, lit by a smile, felt her own laughter bubble up, a sound of pure joy. Elias turned, a polishing cloth in his hand, and a slow, wide grin spread across his face. He began to giggle. The three of them stood in the kitchen, surrounded by food, and laughed. The sound filled the house, chasing out the last of the ghosts. The family, which had been forged in a storm and defended in a church, was finally, and truly, named. The laughter died when a knock came at the door. It was Red Hawk. He was not smiling. "Pike is preparing," he said. "He is moving his men." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy object, wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table, amid the flour and spices. "I found this at the gravesite. After the storm, they were careless." He unwrapped it. It was the head of an iron axe. The wooden handle snapped off. Stamped into the metal, faint but clear, was the mark of the Gallows Ridge mine. "He is a fool," Samuel said, his voice cold. "He is arrogant," Red Hawk corrected. "He believes he is untouchable." He looked at Rose. "Keep this, keep it safe. It is the truth. And tomorrow, he will try to burn the truth." He looked around the kitchen, at the mountains of food. "Your fire is strong, baker woman, but he is bringing gunmen. I have seen them, men who are not miners, dressed as my people. He plans to turn your feast into a massacre." The town did not come all at once. They came in small, hesitant groups, pulled by the smell of roasting beef and a curiosity stronger than their prejudice. They stood on the packed snow of the ranch yard, their hands shoved in their pockets, their faces wary. They looked like a jury, ready to deliver a verdict. Rose had set up long plank tables near the house, away from the barn. The tables were laden with her work platters of sliced beef, deep dishes of beans and molasses, mountains of potatoes, and bread. So much bread, sourdough, rye, and cornbread. Samuel stood on the porch, his arm in its sling, a silent host. He watched as his men, Jed and the others, moved among the townsfolk, offering cups of black, hot coffee. Elias, his face scrubbed bright, ran between the kitchen and the tables, his chest puffed with the importance of his work. The tension was high. Mrs. Dalton was there, her face a mask of disapproval, but she was watching the food. Then, a new group arrived. They did not come from the town road. They came from the high trail, Red Hawk, and the two Cheyenne elders from the storm. They were not in hunting leathers. They were in their ceremonial dress, their buckskins adorned with intricate beadwork, their hair bound with honor bands. They moved with a slow, profound dignity that silenced the nervous chatter of the crowd. The townsfolk tensed. The miners' hands moved toward their belts. This was not a feast. It was a confrontation. Luther Pike, who had been standing near the back, smiled. This was exactly what he had wanted. Rose came out of the kitchen, her hands covered in flour. She looked at the Cheyenne, at the townsfolk, at the invisible line drawn in the snow between them. She walked to the center of the yard, her heart hammering. She held up a single, round, dark loaf of bread. "Welcome," she said, her voice clear in the cold air. "Thank you for coming. I have cooked for you." She held up the dark loaf. This is special. This is not my recipe. It is made from a parched corn and sunflower seed, a grain I did not know." She looked at Red Hawk, who met her gaze and nodded. "Once, it was a gift from the Cheyenne people, who have used this grain for 1,000 years. It is strong. It is meant to feed a family through a long journey." She broke the bread, the steam rising from its center. "Today, we are all on a journey. I hope you will share this with me. And with them." She offered the first piece not to the preacher, not to Mrs. Dalton, but to Red Hawk. He took it, his face solemn, and ate. He then took a piece and offered it back to her. She ate. A bridge built of flour. The crowd watched, stunned. A few people, slowly, moved toward the tables. A miner, his face rough, tried a piece of the Cheyenne bread. He chewed, he nodded. "It is good." The truce began. People began to eat. They ate the beef, they ate the beans, and they ate the bread. The sounds of forks on plates, of low, surprised conversation, began to fill the yard. It was working. Rose felt Samuel's good hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Rose." Then a shout, "Fire!" It was Jed, pointing toward the big barn. A thick, oily column of black smoke was pouring from the hayloft window. "The hay," a man screamed. "It is the winter feed." As the word "fire" echoed, the second part of the plan began. From the woods, on the far side of the barn, came a series of whoops, a high, terrifying sound. 6 men on horseback burst from the pines. They were dressed as Cheyenne, their faces smeared with crude paint, feathers in their hair. They were not Red Hawk's people. They were a mockery. "Savages misses!" Dalton shrieked, pointing. Pike was right. "It is an attack." The fake Cheyenne fired their rifles into the air, the gunshots echoing off the mountain. They began to circle the barn, screaming, driving the terrified townsfolk back toward the house. Panic erupted. People dropped their plates, grabbing their children, their fear instantly turning to blind hatred. "Kill them!" a miner yelled, pulling his pistol. "No!" Samuel roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "They are not!" But it was too late. The trap was sprung. Red Hawk and Samuel moved as one. They did not run from the fire. They ran toward it. "Jed, the water trough," Samuel bellowed, his bad arm forgotten. "Bucket Brigade, save the barn. Those are not Cheyenne, they are liars." "Red Hawk," he yelled, and the Cheyenne warrior was already moving. He had seen what Samuel had seen. One of the fake Cheyenne was not just firing in the air. He had dismounted and was running toward the ranch house with a lit torch, his goal to set the house on fire and trap the people. Red Hawk moved like a shadow. He intercepted the man in a running tackle, a blur of buckskin and fury. The 2 men rolled in the snow, the torch hissing as it was extinguished. Elias, who had been frozen in terror, saw the chaos. He saw Jed and the few ranch hands trying to form a line. He saw the fire growing. He did not have a bucket. He was too small, but he had a job. He ran to the porch, grabbed the long, polished cattle horn that Samuel used to call the men, and put it to his lips. He blew a long, deep, piercing note, A sound of alarm that cut through the screams and the gunshots. It was a signal. It was a call to arms. The ranch hands, who had been hesitant, now had a leader. They formed the bucket line, their faces grim. A boy's courage had shamed the men into action. The fire was roaring, the heat intense. The barn was full of dry hay. It was going up like a torch. A gust of wind sent a shower of burning embers toward the house, toward the crowd huddled on the porch. Rose was pushing people back, herding them. Inside, get inside the house. She saw a woman stumble, her face white with terror. It was the woman who had sneered at her with Mrs. Dalton, the woman's child. A small boy of 4 had been pulled from her hand. The boy, terrified and fascinated, was running, not toward the house, but toward the fire, toward the horses. A burning rafter at the front of the hayloft gave way, crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks, blocking the boy's way back. He was trapped between the inferno and the fake Cheyenne who were still circling and firing. "My baby," the woman screamed. Rose did not think. She ran. She ran from the safety of the porch, across the open snow, her dress flying. She scooped the boy up, her baker's arms strong. As she turned, a second rafter began to fall. She had no time. She threw herself and the child forward, rolling, covering his small body with her own as the burning wood and hay rained down around them. The mother ran out, sobbing, and pulled her child from beneath Rose. The boy was crying, but unharmed. The woman looked at Rose, at the back of her dress, which was smoldering. The woman beat out the small flames with her bare hands, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning, terrible shame. "God forgive me," the woman whispered, and she pulled Rose into her arms, in front of everyone. Across the yard, Red Hawk had subdued his man. He dragged the struggling, cursing figure into the center of the yard and tore the fake feathered headdress from his head. "Look," Red Hawk shouted, his voice ringing. "Look at your savage." It was Tom Fuller, a miner, a man everyone knew, a man who worked for Luther Pike. Samuel, his face black with soot, his sling burned away, stood over the man. "Who paid you, Tom?" Fuller spat in the snow. "Go to hell. Hayes." Samuel looked at the crowd. Their faces were no longer angry. They were confused. They looked at the burning barn, at the woman clutching Rose, at the unmasked man. "He said no one would get hurt," Fuller suddenly blurted, his eyes wide with fear. "He said just to scare them, just to make it look like the savages did it." Who said? Samuel's voice was like ice. "Pike, Luther Pike. He paid us. He paid us all." The crowd turned as one. Luther Pike, who had been watching the chaos from his horse at the edge of the ranch, saw the tide turn. He saw the faces, no longer looking at Red Hawk, but at him. He cursed, a single, violent word. He wheeled his massive horse, dug his spurs in, and bolted. He was not going to town. He was heading for the high pass, toward the narrow, winding cut of Early Bone Canyon. "He is getting away," Jed shouted. Samuel was already running for his own horse, tied by the porch. He grabbed his rifle from its scabbard, his face a mask of grim, cold fury. Red Hawk was already on his pony, his face set. They took off, 2 riders, one with a useless arm, one representing a wronged people, chasing the man who had tried to burn them all. Rose watched them go. She saw Samuel, his body tight with pain, ride into the wilderness. She saw the smoking ruin of the barn, the huddled crowd, the captured man. She ran to the medical bag she always kept in the kitchen. She grabbed a spare horse, the one Jed had been riding, and kicked it into a gallop. She was not a fighter. She was a healer, and they would need her. She rode hard, following their tracks in the snow, toward the canyon. The canyon was a narrow, icy slot in the rock, the wind whistling through it. They found Pike's first man halfway in. He was the sharpshooter. He was waiting on a high ledge. The first shot was a clean miss, the bullet ricocheting off the ice with a high, thin scream. The second was closer. It tore through the buckskin on Red Hawk's left arm, a hot, searing graze. "He is high!" Samuel yelled, pulling his horse behind a boulder. He dismounted, his rifle in his one good hand. He was a dead man, one-handed against a sharpshooter, but he did not hesitate. He laid the rifle on the rock, bracing it, draw his fire. Red Hawk. Red Hawk, his arm bleeding, needed no other command. He moved his pony out, a feint, and the shot came. Crack! Samuel, his eye on the puff of smoke from the ledge, fired. His one good arm was steady. The shot was true. A scream echoed down the canyon, and the man's rifle clattered down the rocks. They moved forward. Rose arrived minutes later. The canyon was quiet, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and rock dust. She saw Red Hawk, his face pale, leaning against the canyon wall, his arm dark with blood. She slid from the horse, her bag in hand. She ripped open his sleeve. The bullet had torn the flesh, but it was clean. "It is nothing," he said, his teeth gritted. "It is not nothing," she said, her hands already working, cleaning the wound, her touch firm and sure. Red Hawk watched her, his gaze intense. He looked at her hands, the baker's hands, now stained with his blood. He looked at her face, smudged with soot, her hair falling from its bun. He smiled, a faint, pained, but genuine smile. "Your fire, baker woman," he said, his voice quiet. "It is much stronger than his gunfire." They found Pike at the end of the canyon. It opened up onto a high, wind-blasted cliff, a sheer drop of 1,000 feet to the rocks below. His horse had lamed, and he was on foot, his expensive coat torn, his face a mask of terror. He was cornered. He looked at Samuel, at the rifle in his one good hand. He looked at Red Hawk, his arm in a sling, his face grim. "Go on," Pike shrieked, his voice breaking. "Do it, savage, push me. It is what your kind does. Is it not avenge your ancestors?" Red Hawk looked at the man. He looked at the cliff edge. He looked at the open sky. Then he looked at Samuel, who was waiting, his rifle steady. Red Hawk did not reach for his knife. He reached for the coil of rope on his saddle. He walked forward, his footsteps silent on the rock. Pike cringed, holding up his hands. "No, please." Red Hawk did not strike him. He began, with a cold, methodical precision, to tie the man's hands. Justice, not revenge. "We will not make you a martyr." "Pike," Samuel said, his voice flat, "you will go back. You will face the town. You will face the law you thought you owned." The journey back to Gallows Ridge was a slow, silent procession. Luther Pike rode in the center, his hands bound by Red Hawk's rope, his face a mask of gray. Defeated fury. Tom Fuller, the captured man, was led by Jed, his head hanging in shame. When they reached the main street, the townsfolk, who had been huddled in frightened, guilty groups, emerged. They saw the burnt, exhausted riders, the bleeding arm of the Cheyenne, the one-armed stillness of Samuel Hayes, and the soot-covered woman who had saved a child. They saw their leader, Pike, a prisoner. Sheriff Brady, his face pale and sweating, bustled forward, his hand on his pistol. "What is the meaning of this, Hayes? You cannot just... This is an outrage." Pike's head snapped up, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Brady, arrest them, arrest this savage. They assaulted me." Before the sheriff could speak, the woman whose child Rose had saved stepped in front of his horse. Her face was black with soot and tears. He did not assault anyone. "Sheriff, he was there, at the ranch. He set the fire. He hired them." She pointed a shaking finger at Fuller. "And that man confessed." I have a writ," Brady stammered, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the paper. "A writ to protect Mr. Pike's property." "His property," the blacksmith roared. Stepping into the street, he burned the barn. He tried to burn the house with our women and children in it, and you gave him the law to do it. The crowd surged forward, their confusion replaced by a cold, clear rage. He was in on it. Brady was in on it. Jed, his face grim, stepped up to the sheriff. "I think, Sheriff, you had best come to your office and give me that badge for safekeeping until the circuit judge arrives." Sheriff Brady looked at the faces, and he saw no allies. His authority had vanished. He was relieved of his post by the consent of the people he had failed. The town hall was not a court, but it was the only space large enough to hold the weight of what had happened. It was packed the next morning, the air thick and heavy. The preacher, his face pale, stood at the front, acting as magistrate. The evidence was laid on the table for all to see, the iron axe head, stamped with the mine's mark. Tom Fuller, his voice a low, trembling mumble, told them everything. He told them how Pike had hired him and 5 others, how they were paid to burn the old granary and leave false tracks, how they were paid to desecrate the Cheyenne graves, to steal bones, to provoke a war, and how, finally, they were paid to attack the feast, to burn the barn, and to make it look like a Cheyenne massacre. "He said no one would get hurt," Fuller whispered, his head in his hands. "He said it was just to scare folks, to make them see the savages were a threat. He just wanted his road." When he finished, a silence so deep it was like the snow on the mountains settled over the room. Then Red Hawk stood. He was not in his ceremonial dress. He was in his simple leathers, his arm in a clean sling Rose had made. He did not speak of the fire. He did not speak of the hatred. He spoke of the land. "You call it a burial ground," he said, his voice quiet. Yet it filled the room. "To you, it is a place where things end. To my people, it is a place where things begin. It is where our grandfathers sleep, and in their sleep, they teach the seeds how to grow. It is where our stories live. You do not build a road over a man's stories. You do not build a house on your mother's grave." He looked at the faces, one by one. "We did not ask for this fight. We asked for respect. We asked for the law. Your law, which says a line is a line." He finished, and he sat down. Samuel was next. He stood with his good arm, his left, resting on the rail. He told them, in his flat mountain man's voice, about the signal lights he and Rose had seen during the storm. Pike was not waiting for the storm to end. He was using it. He was moving men, digging in the dark, while the rest of us were fighting for our lives, while Rose was pulling that boy from the ice. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words were heavy as stone. Finally, the preacher called for Rose. She walked to the front, her hands clasped. She was not a speaker. She was a baker. "I do not know about laws," she began, her voice soft. But it carried, "I do not know about roads or mines." She looked at the crowd, at Mrs. Dalton, at the woman whose child she had saved. "I only know about being hungry and about being cold. I came to this town, and I was cold. I was judged for what I was not pretty, not married, not worthy." She took a breath. "When the storm came, the one that saved Elias, I was in Samuel's kitchen, and I was warm, and I had a purpose. I made food, and the house came alive. The men were stronger. The boy was saved. The fire in the kitchen, it was good. I thought," she said, her voice growing stronger, "that I could bring that to Gallows Ridge. I thought, if we all ate at the same table, we would see that we are all just hungry. We are all just cold. We are all just afraid." Her gaze found Luther Pike, who sat, bound, between 2 miners. "Mister, Pike did not just burn a barn. He did not just try to start a war. He tried to burn a bridge. He tried to burn the one thing that could have saved us. He tried to stop us from eating together." She stood, her small, plain figure a column of simple, unshakable truth. The room was still. Then the blacksmith, the one who had watched her in the market, stood up. "Preacher," he said, his voice thick, "I have a petition here. It asks the territorial government to make the South Meadows a protected zone. For the Cheyenne, it asks that the ore road be rerouted to the north, around their land. He unrolled the parchment. I will be the first to sign. One by one, the people of Gallows Ridge walked to the front. The miner whose child was saved. The woman who had thrown mud. They signed. The line was long. A few days later, a buggy, small and black, made its way up the ranch road. Mrs. Dalton sat on the seat, her back rigid. She found Rose in the kitchen, which was already, impossibly, producing the smell of fresh bread. I was cleaning, Mrs., Dalton said, her eyes not meeting Rose's. She held out a small, wooden box. I found these. They were packed away. Your mother's old baking tins. I must have misplaced them. Rose looked at the tins. They were the ones Mrs. Dalton had kept sold in her mind to cover the back rent. They were a peace offering, an apology, wrapped in a lie. Thank you, Mrs. Dalton, Rose said, taking the box. It is kind of you to return them. The landlady's face turned a dull red. She nodded, curtly, and turned and left. It was the best she could do. That same week, Samuel, his arm still in a sling but his shoulder mending, sat at the preacher's desk. He was signing a set of papers with his left hand, his script slow and careful. The papers legally declared Elias an apprentice to the Hayes Ranch. They named Samuel Hayes as his legal guardian. Elias, who stood beside him, was no longer a stray. He had a home. He had a name. He had a job. The town, slowly, began to heal. They were rebuilding the barn, the entire town, miners and ranchers working side by side, and they were buying Rose's bread. Jed built a small, neat sign at the bottom of the ranch road. It said, Rose's Hearth, deliveries to town Tuesdays and Fridays. She could not bake enough. They were not just buying bread. They were buying atonement. They were buying a piece of her strength, her fire. Her kitchen had become the new center of the town's economy, and its heart. One evening, as the sun was setting, turning the snow to a deep, royal purple, Red Hawk came to the house. He was alone. He carried a heavy, folded blanket. He found them in the main room, by the fire. Rose was reading to Elias. Samuel was mending a piece of harness with his good hand. I have come to bless this house, Red Hawk said, his voice soft. He unfolded the blanket. It was beautiful, a hand-woven masterpiece of dark reds, deep browns, and a startling, clear blue, the colors of the earth and the sky. He did not give it to Samuel. He walked to the main table, to the chair at its head, the place where Rose sat, and he draped the heavy, warm blanket over it. Our people say a home is not the wood, he said. A home is the fire. You, baker woman, are the fire. You have fed us. You have fed our enemies. You have made peace. He placed his hand on the blanket. This house and my house are now at peace. Rose touched the wool. It was the warmest thing she had ever felt. Later that night, she could not find Samuel. He was not by the fire, not in the kitchen. She found him in the small, dark room, the one with the rocking horse. He was not just sitting in it. He was working. The dust was gone. The room was clean. He had, with his one good hand, been sanding the small wooden horse, the one his son had used. The grain of the wood, lost under years of dust and grief, was shining a deep, rich gold in the lamplight. He had placed it by the window, so it could look out over the valley. It was no longer a ghost. It was no longer a wound. It was a memory. He looked up as she entered. It was his, he said, his voice quiet, naming the ghost. His name was Little Sam. Rose put her hand on his good shoulder. I think, Samuel said, his voice thick, I think he would have liked Elias. I think he would have liked the noise. Rose said nothing. She just stood with him, her hand on his shoulder, in the small, mended room, while the horse watched the snow and the kitchen fire burned bright. Spring came to Gray Mist Valley not as a gentle thaw, but as a slow, hard-fought battle against the ice. The snows retreated, leaving the land scoured and clean, the scent of damp earth and new pine rising like a promise. The mountains, which had been a white, menacing wall, turned a soft purple in the evenings, the great herds of elk returning to the meadows. Luther Pike was gone. He had been taken by the territorial marshal, bound in his own expensive-looking cuffs. The trial, held in a larger town with a federal judge, was short. With the unified testimony of an entire town, the confession of Tom Fuller, and the damning evidence of the mine's axe head found at the graves, Pike was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. The Gallows Ridge mine was seized by the government and sold. The new owners, a quiet firm from back east, immediately met with Red Hawk and the new town council. The ore road was rerouted, a full 3 miles north, leaving the ancestral grounds in peace. Gallows Ridge itself was mending. The barn at the Hayes Ranch had been rebuilt, a communal effort of miners, ranchers, and even the town's preacher. The burned-out granary was cleared, and a new one, larger, was funded by the mine as a token of goodwill. Rose had returned to her stall in the town square, not because she needed the money, but because the town needed the bread. The first day, the loafers were absent. The women who had scorned her looked at their shoes as they passed. Then the woman whose child Rose had saved walked up to the stall. She did not speak. She simply placed a silver dollar on the table for a 10-cent loaf of bread and took it. "God bless you, miss," she murmured, and walked away. After that, they came, one by one. The people who had judged her, who had whispered, who had thrown mud. They did not apologize. They did not have the words for it. Instead, they left coins. They paid a quarter for a biscuit. They paid $1 for cornbread. It was a clumsy, Western apology, a silent, stubborn admission of debt, and Rose accepted every coin with quiet dignity. Her kitchen fire had become the town's bank of forgiveness. The true healing, however, happened not in town, but on the porch of the log house, high up the mountain. It was an evening in late spring. The sunset was a deep, impossible purple, the air so clear it hurt to breathe. The snow was gone, and the wind, the one that had screamed like a monster, was now a soft, warm breeze. They were all on the porch. Samuel, his arm finally out of the sling, the strength returning to his shoulder, sat in a chair he had built. Rose sat in another, a stillness in her hands that was new. Elias, his apprenticeship now official, was sitting on the steps, carefully whittling a small bird from a piece of pine. The meal was not a feast. It was a covenant. It was the food that had defined them, a pot of beans, a fresh loaf of sourdough, and mugs of strong, black coffee. 2 guests stood before them, their shadows long in the twilight. Red Hawk, his arm now healed, bearing only a thin white scar, and Jed, the ranch foreman, his hat held respectfully in his hands. They were the witnesses, one for the mountain, one for the ranch. Red Hawk stepped forward. He held not a blanket, but a single, thin ribbon of bright blue silk. "In the storm, we saw the fire," he said, his voice quiet. "Now, in the peace, we see the wind. A house must honor the wind." He walked to the main porch post, the one that had taken the worst of the blizzard, and tied the ribbon to it. It fluttered, a small, bright flag of impossible color against the rough-hewn log. "My grandfather taught me of the hawk," Red Hawk said, looking at Samuel, then at Rose. "The white man sees the hawk, and he builds a cage. He wants to own the strength. He wants to own the flight." He shook his head. "But the hawk is not the cage. The hawk is the sky. He is only free when he chooses his own path. He is only strong when he chooses where to land, and when he chooses to return." He looked at the 2 of them, his eyes holding the wisdom of the land. "This house is a strong branch, but the wind must be free." It was his blessing, a metaphor for a love that did not bind, but supported. Jed shuffled, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, "Sir, the men, we just wanted to say, the ranch ain't been this strong in ever. It is good to hear laughing in the mess hall." It was his blessing. When they were gone, Samuel stood. He walked over to Rose. He did not kneel. He did not have a ring. He had only what was real. He held out his hand, the one he had held her with in the storm. "Rose Whitaker," he said, his voice low and steady, the ghosts of his past finally gone from his eyes. "You came to my house as a refugee. You stayed as a cook." She took his hand, her hand, calloused from work, fit into his, scarred from life. "You gave me a roof, Samuel." "I gave you a roof," he said, his voice thick. "You gave me a home, but this house, it has been my house for too long." He looked at the open doorway, at the warm, yellow light of the kitchen spilling out onto the porch. He was standing at the threshold again. "This house," he said, turning back to her, his gaze holding hers, "is not just mine anymore." He did not ask a question. He made a statement. He was inviting her to cross the threshold, not as a guest, not as a cook, but as a partner. "No," Rose whispered, her eyes filling with tears she had held back for a lifetime. "It is not." She stepped past him, into the house, into the light. From the kitchen table, a sound erupted. Elias, who had been watching, his face split by a grin, let out a whoop of pure joy, a bright, triumphant laugh that echoed off the rafters. It was the sound of a boy who was no longer an orphan, the sound of a home. Rose smiled, the tears running freely now. She turned to the stove, the great iron heart of the house, and opened the oven door. A wave of perfect, golden heat washed over her, the smell of rising bread, the smell of her life. The kitchen, the storm, the threshold, the circle was closed, the fire was lit, the house was safe. The threshold had been crossed into a new life. The ranch became a meeting place, a crossroads between the town of Gallows Ridge and the high meadows of the Cheyenne. Rose's hearth was known not just for bread, but for justice. Rose looked out the window, at the purple valley, at the man on the porch, at the boy at the table. Freedom in the West, she thought, was not about doing what you wanted or being alone. It was about finding your work and keeping your word. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us by adding a hype by pressing the hype button. It helps this story reach more people.